Today, we're taking a strictly chronological journey through a full century of geopolitics. We're looking at Shaping the World Order, a century of unintended consequences. We'll be tracing the lines from past decisions straight to our modern reality, relying entirely on the historical record to guide us. Let's go. Let's get right into it. Have you ever wondered how secret meetings a century ago actually shaped today's world order? It's pretty fascinating to consider how long-term realities, the borders, the financial systems, the conflicts we literally see on the news today, often stem from short-term, strategic decisions made by a handful of people behind closed doors. It's a massive reminder of cause and effect.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap: Israel and the Cold War. Third, the petrodollar system. Fourth, the Soviet-Afghan War. And finally, 9/11 and modern wars.
Let's quickly anchor ourselves in time here. We're basically tracking a massive domino effect, from the Sykes Picot Agreement in 1916 to the creation of Israel in 1948, the collapse of Bretton Woods in 71, the Soviet-Afghan War in 79, and then the 9/11 attacks in 2001. Each one of these historical events cascades directly into the next. Section 1, World War I at Imperial Borders. Right, so the looming collapse of the Ottoman Empire led directly to the Sykes-Picot Agreement. This was negotiated in secret during World War I by Mark Sykes of Britain and François-Georges Picot of France. They were basically planning how to divide the Middle East into artificial zones of control. Legend has it they literally used a ruler on a map to draw straight lines across the desert. This wasn't some eternal grand master plan. It was classic imperial politics, prioritizing their own global strategy over the actual realities on the ground. And the impact of Sykes-Picot was absolutely profound, because these diplomats drew lines on a map that completely ignored the ethnic, tribal, and religious realities of the people who actually lived there. They inadvertently laid the groundwork for decades of strife. They contributed heavily to the modern, often super volatile borders of places like Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. Now let's see how this builds with another pivotal document from the exact same era, the Balfour Declaration. Just notice this specific phrasing from Arthur Balfour's letter, supporting a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. Those few words physically grounded the geopolitical claims that would very soon cause a massive shift in the entire region. But context matters deeply here, and this theme of unintended consequences really takes off. Britain was simultaneously making entirely conflicting promises. On one hand, they were promising independence to Arab leaders. On the other, promising a Jewish homeland to Zionist leaders. And no, this wasn't some hidden conspiracy, it was just a messy tangle of overlapping politics. The unintended blowback? A dramatic increase in Jewish migration to Palestine and rapidly growing tensions between Arab and Jewish communities. Section 2, Israel and the Cold War. So the creation of Israel definitely wasn't engineered overnight. It was a highly complex chain reaction. First, Jewish migration had been steadily increasing over decades. Second, following the absolute horror of the Holocaust, global support for a Jewish state intensified dramatically. Third, the United Nations proposed a partition plan. And finally, in 1948, Israel declared independence, which immediately prompted neighboring Arab states to invade, sparking a full-scale war. The immediate aftermath of that 1948 war was deeply, deeply consequential. The conflict resulted in massive Palestinian displacement, an event known as the Nakba. This cemented an ongoing regional conflict that honestly continues to dominate international relations to this very day. Now, while the Middle East was rapidly reshaping itself, a new, incredibly tense global framework was descending: the Cold War reality. This was a dangerous, high-stakes ideological rivalry between the US and the Soviet Union. And because nuclear deterrence essentially prevented a direct, catastrophic war, they turned the entire globe into a strategic chessboard, engaging in devastating proxy wars in places like Korea, Vietnam, and Afghanistan. Section 3, the petrodollar system. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the 1970s brought a seismic financial shift that changed the world order all over again. In 1971, the old economic order, the Bretton Woods system, completely collapsed. And in the void left behind, the United States moved incredibly swiftly to make crucial strategic agreements with Saudi Arabia, effectively birthing a brand new economic paradigm.
Let's break down exactly how this petrodollar agreement functioned, because it's fascinating. It basically had two main requirements. First, Saudi oil would be largely priced and traded in US dollars. Second, those massive oil revenues would then be reinvested back into US markets. We're talking hundreds of billions of dollars flooding straight into the American economy. It was a brilliant strategic maneuver, allowing the US to drastically strengthen its global financial influence through economics rather than just military might.
But there is an absolutely crucial nuance here. Yes, this strategy creates a massive global demand for US dollars, but it works primarily because the US economy is exceptionally large and stable. It wasn't just absolute forceful economic domination. It relied heavily on the sheer market reality and the stability that the US provided to international investors. Section 4. The Soviet-Afghan War. Let's look at a critical decade of proxy warfare. In 1979, the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. Throughout the 1980s, the U.S. responded by supporting the Afghan resistance, known collectively as the Mujahideen. When the war finally ended with the Soviet withdrawal in 1989, Afghanistan was left deeply, deeply destabilized. This single decade perfectly set the stage for the massive conflicts of the incoming 21st century.
Which brings us to a major historical misconception. Did the U.S. directly create Osama bin Laden? Well, it's the elephant in the room, right? It's a claim you hear all the time when discussing this specific era of history.
So, the crucial point is, let's look at the facts based strictly on the historical record. The myth is that the U.S. directly funded and trained Osama bin Laden personally, but the reality is quite different. The U.S. broadly supported various resistance groups fighting the Soviets, sure, but there is zero solid evidence of direct personal U.S. backing for bin Laden. Al-Qaeda's formation was ultimately an unintended consequence of that post-war regional instability. History is much more often about unpredictable blowback than perfectly executed master plans.
Section 5. 9/11 and Modern Wars.
The facts of the September 11 attacks are deeply etched into our modern history. Coordinated by al-Qaeda, these devastating attacks killed nearly 3,000 people. Geopolitically, this single horrific event acted as the ultimate catalyst for an unprecedented global shift. It immediately triggered the global war on terror and led to a massive, sweeping expansion of U.S. security and military policy around the entire world. We can see the direct result of that massive policy expansion by comparing two major modern conflicts. The Afghanistan War, launched in 2001, had the goal of removing the Taliban and dismantling al-Qaeda. It ultimately became the longest U.S. war in history. Then, the Iraq War in 2003 was justified by claims of neutralizing weapons of mass destruction. However, as we know, no WMDs were found. This led to intense criticism over intelligence failures, and much like the borders drawn by empires nearly a century earlier, it resulted in massive regional instability that continues today. Which leaves us with a final, critical thought to ponder. If a century of secret agreements, proxy wars, and strategic interventions consistently led to a cascade of unintended consequences, what will today's policies create tomorrow? As you continue learning, I challenge you to apply this structured, historical lens to the news you consume. Remember, the world order is rarely a perfect blueprint. It's a living, breathing chain reaction. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the history behind the headlines.